The Second World War saw the United States expand on their patrol torpedo boats in the Pacific theater. Reason for this was in part thanks to the brave rescue of General Douglas MacArthur and his family by Captain John Bulkeley using one of the nimble vessels. There was another great man serving in the Pacific theater. Unfortunately, his ship was sunk by a Japanese warship, and for several days it seemed very likely he and his crew would not survive their shipwreck. If they had not survived this ordeal, the United States would not have had one of their most iconic presidents ever. His name was John F. Kennedy, and he served on one of those patrol torpedo boats. Torpedoes had been in use for a while before the Second and even the First World War. During the Russo-Turkish War of the 1870s, it is said Stepan Makarov, who would become an admiral of the Russian fleet, was one of the pioneers in using torpedoes. I have created 2 videos about the Russo-Japanese War if that is something you'd like to know more about, or Makarov certainly features in it. Now, by the 1930s, the United States had developed its own patrol torpedo boats, or PT for short. These US PTs could carry 34 to 38 tons in weight. They were powered by 3 Shaft patrol engines, and their maximum speed was 40 knots, which is around 46 miles per hour, or 74 kilometers per hour. The boats were equipped with 4 18 or 21-inch torpedo tubes and 1 40 or 2 20-millimeter guns. Between 12 and 17 men could sail on the boats. During the Second World War, these boats would prove very effective and agile. They would operate in the Mediterranean Sea, the English Channel, and the Pacific theater of war. And the Pacific theater would be the first place where the PT boats managed to really take the spotlight. Under the command of Lieutenant Commander John Bulkeley, in January 1942, the PT-34 nosed into Subic Bay on the west of the Philippines. It was about a month after the Japanese had invaded the Philippines. Bulkeley slowly sailed into the bay during midnight, completely shrouded in the dark, when he noticed a Japanese transport. With a single torpedo at half kilometers distance, he fired at it. It was a direct hit, and the Japanese ship sank within minutes. Thing is, Bulkeley hadn't launched just 1 but 2 torpedoes. One of them was stuck halfway out of its tube with the engine still roaring. The PT-34 was in trouble. Due to its position, the now rapidly heating up torpedo wasn't submerged with water to cool it off anymore. This torpedo, which was on a so-called hot run, disintegrates within seconds, with all nasty consequences tied to it. Acting in both a panic and the dark, Chief Torpedo Man Martino managed to close the compressed airline. The PT-34 had averted the crisis and slowly sailed out of Subic Bay as the torpedo tumbled into the sea. It was just one of the many examples of risks tied to these boats. During the initial stages of the war in the Pacific theater, Japan enjoyed a steamroll campaign. They swept through the Pacific, and the only fleet the US had in the area were PT boats. They operated from improvised bases with equipment that could not be replaced. It wasn't looking too good for the Allied powers. In March 1942, once again under the command of Bulkeley, the PT boats put the spotlight on their actions again. Bulkeley rescued General Douglas MacArthur, who was ordered to leave the Philippines from the Bataan Peninsula. He carried him and his family through nearly 1,000 kilometers of enemy waters to safety. It was this rescue that now kick-started the development of PT boats. MacArthur had been so impressed with the nimble boats, able to stalk enemy warships and get away in a flexible manner, maneuvering between the scattered islands territories, that he wanted to expand the PT boat program. Bulkeley and his colleagues were to return home to the US in order to instruct and educate the next generation of PT boat crews. No time was wasted, and by the end of 1942, the PT boat force in the Pacific was expanding rapidly. They were based on the island of Tulaji. For now, their priority was attempting to block the Japanese to reinforce their troops on nearby Guadalcanal. The PTs were ideal for this. They pestered the heavily guarded Japanese convoys known as the Tokyo Express. Now, every soldier in the Pacific theater endured rough conditions, to put it mildly. The crew of PT boats had it no different. Their bases were improvised and primitive. The refueling of PTs was grueling. It had to be done by hand, and chamois leather was used to remove water. To hide the boats from the Japanese during the day, they were hidden under mangrove trees. No other than the Flying Tigers hid their planes in Burma, might I add. Due to hiding the boats under these trees, they became infested with rodents. Even more uncomfortable was that these locations often doubled as sleeping places for the men. Their tasks were mundane most of the time, no other than any other soldier. They didn't see action every day, and their general way of killing time was by waiting and transferring men and equipment between the big US warships that now arrived in the theater. But when they did see action, they were a small force, to be reckoned with for sure. When the Battle of the Bismarck Sea broke out in 1943, the PT boats based in New Guinea sank large Japanese transport ships carrying troops. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were lost as a result, and many of these soldiers weren't given time to drown. It was the PT boat's task to sail towards the sinking ship and mow down any surviving soldier that swam in the water. Such was the reality of this brutal war. The same month as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, a lieutenant took up his post in the South Pacific. He would replace the commander of the PT-109, and his name was John F. Kennedy, and he certainly experienced some action during the war. By August 1943, the Japanese were in retreat in the Pacific. The Allies now tried to gain the upper hand and set out new objectives, the islands of Bougainville and New Georgia. Kennedy's PT-109 was tasked with preventing Japanese convoys from reaching the islands, and they set out on their mission waiting for the Japanese convoy. They happened to miss this convoy as it sailed towards the islands. The PT-109 was caught by a Japanese warship searchlight and had to quickly sail away and evade further detection to prevent being sunk. Later that same night, in the dark, the PT boat was idling in the water, waiting for the Japanese to sail back from the islands. As it sat there, out of nowhere it was rammed by the destroyer Amagiri. The PT was torn in two pieces with a fuel tank exploding. As panic arose on the boat, Kennedy ordered his crew to abandon ship. The next couple of hours, the crew would be floating in the water of the Pacific, hoping to avoid Japanese detection. The next morning, at the dawn of day, the survivors of the incident clung onto part of what was once the boat's hull. Of the 13 men, 2 had been lost, and the third, Patrick McMahon, was gravely injured. They were floating close to the island to the degree that they could see the Japanese on the island. They were in a dangerous position and quickly needed to get away. Kennedy and his crew paddled for 5 hours hidden behind a plank that was once part of their PT, and Kennedy swam breaststroke, pulling McMahon behind him by clenching his teeth on a strap tied to McMahon's life vest. It was an agonizing journey, but they made it. 5 kilometers away, they finally reached the beach of an island. Now that they were in a temporary safety, Kennedy swam out into the strait with a lit lantern, hoping a passing PT boat would recognize them. The attempt nearly cost him his life, as he was almost swept away. They needed to reach a larger island, in the hopes that the Allied fleet would pass by. Once again, Kennedy towed towards McMahon as the crew swam breaststroke to another island. Once this island was reached, they realized fresh coconuts grew on it, but there was no fresh water. Kennedy, now together with shipmate George Ross, swam to Nauru Island, 1 hour away, in search of supplies. A windstorm nearly put an end to that. They were almost blown away again. Once they reached the Nauru Island, they found food supplies left by the Japanese, but more importantly, they found a 50-pound gallon of clean water. At least they had that going for them, but the situation seemed rather hopeless, and the crew was running out of options what they could do to be rescued by Allied ships before they were detected by Japanese reconnaissance planes or ships. As the crew continued foraging for food and water on the island, Kennedy encountered 2 Solomon Islanders in a canoe that happened to pass by. These men were Ironi Kumana and Byuku Gasa, and they initially thought the Americans were Japanese and quickly paddled away. On their retreat, they encountered the rest of the stranded crew. These natives worked as coast watchers and could be a way out of this situation for the crew. Kennedy took a coconut and engraved a message on it for them to carry back to their Coast Watch commander. It read, "Nauru Island, commander's native nose posted. He can pilot, 11 alive, needs small boat. Kennedy." Now, What Kennedy didn't know was that the morning after the PT-109 was rammed by the Japanese warship, an Australian coast watcher, Lieutenant A.R. Evans, spotted the capsized hull. He had a secret outpost on a volcanic outcrop. Evans manned the outpost in order to gather intelligence on the Japanese. It was hidden behind enemy lines, and being a coast watcher thus was not without risk. These men were in enemy territory, often hidden, attempting to gather information on the Japanese and reporting on them via radio. It was Evans' sighting and dispatch that finally led to the rescue of Kennedy and his crew. On August 7, 5 days after the crash, several natives in a war canoe arrived to take Kennedy back to Evans. The crew was rescued after some extremely tense days, and, well, the rest is history, isn't it? John F. Kennedy became not just a war hero, he was awarded the Purple Heart and the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, and in 1961, he was inauguration as President of the United States. Kennedy even invited Kumana and Gasa to his presidential inauguration, though politics prevented them from coming. Coast Watcher Evans, however, did attend, and a mock-up of the PT-109 graced it as well. The famous coconut inscribed with his message was placed on the desk in the Oval Office, where it would remain until Kennedy sadly was assassinated in 1963. And that is one of the lesser-known stories about the great life JFK lived. It certainly says a lot about his character as a man. Thank you for watching this video. I would also like to thank all my patrons for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and want to support my work, consider checking me out on Patreon for just $1 a month. You will gain access to the exclusive Patreon series. And if there is a person or event from the Second World War you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.